Let's just pray and echo those words of what we've just sung. And Lord, speak to us as we come to us. Feed us with the food of your word. Change us. Change the way we see ourselves and the world around us as we look through the lens, not just of your word, but of your Son, Jesus Christ. We ask in his name. Amen. So if you permit me for a moment to walk on eggshells, as soon as you start talking about these things, people go, oh, where's he going to go? But there's lots in the media for a little while, and in politics, and in education, about identity. How do we view ourselves or others? And I want to say up front where I'm going is that Jesus offers us a better way, but a more challenging way to do that. And I'm not claiming to solve all the tensions in our society now in one sermon, but it's a start. Whatever you think as well, whatever your politics are this morning, if you sit a bit to the left or a bit further to the left or a bit to the right, I may make you feel awkward a couple of times. And just for the sake of balance, anyone centrally as well, I'll do that too. So think for a moment how you might think of others or how one might think of another. Well, put it up there straight away. There's the old-fashioned, obvious racism that by someone's appearance, we make negative judgments about them or assumptions. And there's other versions of that. So we don't just think racism is the only problem. There's other ways we can do that to do with people's class or something else about them. Any way that we go, that lot over there, you know what their problem is? That's obviously not a good thing. And it seems to lie deep in our hearts, but we know that's a bad thing. Now, there's various theories out there. For example, one called critical race theory. By the way, we're going to get to Mark's Gospel. And there's others which divide people up by historic grievances to do with privileges and disadvantages. And then we try and play life a bit like a golf handicap. So if you've done very well, you can play from scratch. If you've from a group that hasn't, then we need to do things that will perhaps help you. And there's actually good instincts in that. There are a few problems with it, as it's been drawn out. So who makes those rules? Draws lines, says who? It can also start to become rather patronizing. Come back to patronizing later. And there's a few biblical problems with it as well. And I think Christ just offers something that is far simpler, way better, but it's the way of the cross. And I think the way of the cross obliterates racism and class distinctions. It blows out of the water left-wing ideology and right-wing ideology, and it tells people in the centre to stop thinking you're balanced. And it affects how we see others. It affects how we see other Christians and churches. It affects how we see ourselves. And it works like this. How do you see Christ? How do you see his identity and his mission? And that Jesus' identity and his mission then becomes a lens that in turn impacts how we see ourselves through him. And then it affects how we see and treat others, and particularly how we see other Christians. Now, as Josiah read this, and if you read it in the Bible that most of us church uses, the ESV, you see it has little headings, and you see we've gone through 3 headings, and it seems like discombobulated things that happened that Jesus said is what it looks like. But I think they actually are held together by the same theme and actually spills into the passage that we will go to next time I start preaching again. It's all about this thing we've been looking at since we picked up Mark again this term, which is, what does it mean to take up my cross to follow a crucified Saviour? And what does it mean, this idea that our eyes, that Jesus is keep on opening our eyes and our ears? So 3 things that these 3 little sections we looked at. Firstly, that Christ is the pattern for us. Secondly, who is the greatest among us? And thirdly, who is the us that we're talking about? They're all connected. So firstly, Christ is the pattern for us. That's in verses 30 to 32. Now, remember how we got here. It's a bit of revision right back when we started looking at Mark, whenever that was. We said, and we've noticed as we've gone through, it's a book of 2 halves. So the first half answers this question: who is Jesus? It shows, it goes on to show us all the things he is, all the things that God says of himself. He does all the things that God does. So Mark 1 verse 1, Mark gives us the answer. He's the Christ, the Son of God. And then he quotes Isaiah, a prophecy of God coming to earth as a man. And then we meet Jesus. We meet the answer to that. And then he goes on through the first half to demonstrate his identity. And then we come to a climax in 8:29 where Peter says, you are the Christ. And we go, we knew that from verse 1. But now he's got it. Sort of and sort of not. Because Jesus goes on then to explain straight away that he must suffer, die on the cross, and rise again. And Peter objects to that. Because Peter's like the blind man we also met who sees nothing and then is blurry in what he sees and then sees with clarity. That's the first half of Mark. Second half that we're now in is what Mark is about, that Jesus is on his way to the cross. And if you want to follow Jesus, you must take up your cross to follow him. And then what does that look like in real life? That's what we're dealing with. And so last week we had the disciples who at that point couldn't do what they once could. They were asked to cast out an evil spirit. They could do that earlier. They can't do it now. Why? Because they don't get this. They can't match that Jesus, his identity with his mission. And Jesus keeps repeating what must happen. So as you read through Mark, he keeps on the phrases like where the reading started this morning, keeps on coming up because they're not getting it and all their problems flow from that. So as I was preparing this and thinking where should we divide up the sermons, I was thinking Jesus keeps repeating himself. Do I keep repeating the sermon? And the answer is sort of. Because if you don't understand Christ's work on the cross, you don't really get how to follow him. And although the disciples missed the point, sometimes almost the comical proportions, the point of it being recorded here is that that's what we do too. So anyone who's read the book of Exodus with a small child and they go, Israel disobeyed again, and you think, and it's sort of funny, but also it's sort of not funny, and it is very what we do. That's why it's there for us. So notice a few things here that Jesus says. So verse 30, he doesn't want anyone to know. Now this has come up before, and we see now why. It's because they're not getting it. So until they can get it, they can't let others know. Verse 31, the Son of Man must be delivered. Delivered by whom? It's the same word that's used at the end when he's handed over to die. Now remember, before we looked at this word, must. This must happen. Jesus must go to the cross, he says. What he's beginning to get us to see is it's not just the Romans and the Jewish authorities that delivered him, but God himself delivered him. That this is God's plan. God delivered him over because there's a purpose that God had for Jesus dying on the cross. And we explained what that was. It comes up from time to time in Mark. This substitution idea that on the cross, he takes our sin and what our sin deserved. We go free because he's taken it from us onto himself. And in the resurrection, that he was raised so we will be raised and share his risen life. This is why it matters. This is why it's really important. Why we say the crux of the matter, the central point of what we're talking about. And then notice verse 32, the disciples do not understand, nor do they ask. And that leads to their problems. So then, and it's true now, ask. If you have a question about the Bible or theology, I can't necessarily help with, say, your computer or car maintenance, but problem with the Bible, theology, you're meant to ask. There's other people here in the room you can ask, but that's what I meant to do. And some people go, I can't ask, I feel stupid. And I've confessed many times before, things have come up in a Bible reading or a sermon, and I've thought, that's obvious now you say it. They ordained me, with me not knowing that. So you're in good company. There's some questions that are obscure and I can't answer straight away or ever. But ask, because normally we can have a stab at it. Normally someone else is asking the question. And there's good pedigree here, isn't there? Ask questions, especially the core things. It's not stupid to ask. We've seen as well, haven't we? It's a spiritual dimension as well, not an intellectual one. So the starting point is we see who Jesus is. So he is the victorious king. He is the suffering servant who goes to the cross. He is, as we thought of the creed, he is God from true God, begotten, not made. In that sense, he is not like you or me at all. But he sets a pattern for us. And that pattern is the cross first and resurrection later. That's our pattern. So he dies on the cross and rose again for our salvation, but then that's also the way to live and follow. So we have to take up our cross, and we do so for the good of others. That's what being a Christian is. And the issues that we sometimes have suggest that we haven't really understood who Jesus is and why he came. So in a sense, we don't move on from that. We might go deeper, but we don't move on. So in a sense, we're always... So a friend of mine criticizes preaching sometimes when he says it's a bit thin. Just gone over the same thing again. And of course, others, we go off into the stratosphere and leave the gospel. No, it's always the gospel. And that's the anchor that we hold ourselves as we might go into we're then looking at the depths of how the gospel applies to everything. And that's sort of what we're starting, just going very shallowly into this morning. So that's the first thing, is that Christ is the pattern for us. So we'll start thinking about what that is. So firstly, or my second point is, who is the greatest among us? It's verses 33 to 37. So once we've got who Jesus is, now we can start thinking about who are we? How do we become great? And who's the greatest here? I mean, presumably if you do anything, you want to do it like reasonably well. So how do you do this well? How do you do this Christianity well? Who's the best Christian? Who is the greatest? Who is the greatest follower of Jesus? How do we quantify that? So who is the greatest Christian in the room? Who is the greatest church? What do you think the greatest church would be like? What is the greatest denomination? Well, the disciples ask that between themselves, and Jesus says, what are you talking about? And they're too embarrassed to say. They know they're asking the wrong question. Verse 35, it says Jesus sat down. That's the position that you would do a formal sermon. So he sits down, prepare for the sermon. It's actually then a one-liner with an illustration. So I've got good biblical precedents for getting kids at the front. That's what Jesus does. So if you look at second half of verse 35, this is his sermon. If anyone will be first, he must be last of all and servant of all. So there you go. That's the answer to their question. The first is last. The great serve. Values that we have are on their head. Now, surely it makes sense, doesn't it, that being first is being first. That's why we try to be first. Surely being the best is the best. If you do well, say you do well at work, you're put in charge of others, and they do the other stuff that you don't want to do. Or you can pay others to do, if you earn enough, you can pay others to do the work that you're not that fussed on. And Jesus says, the greatest serves. And he illustrates this in verses 36 to 37. And he took a child and put him in the midst of them. And taking him in his arms, he said to them, whoever receives one such child in my name receives me. And whoever receives me receives not me, but him who sent me. Now, children are adorable, aren't they? Just seen Abel wander in and wander back out again. Good job he wasn't here, because you wouldn't be paying attention, because these little ones are adorable. They don't offer much, though, do they, really? When you think about it. I mean, churches want loads of kids in their church. Why? It's just a load of effort for us, isn't it? And they're expensive. They can't do anything. Sometimes one of the kids will come up to you after service and say, want to talk to me. And I don't say, well, have you got anything I don't already know? No? Right. That's children, adorable, but don't offer much. And that's how Jesus says we're to treat each other. And that's how he treats us. Now, how can this be so in Christ's kingdom? Well, because of what we've just thought about. In verses 30 to 32, this is the pattern for how he treats us, and pattern for us to live is how we treat each other and see ourselves. Because the eternal Son, the King of the universe, God from God, light from light, because he was born in obscurity and served and died, because Christ made himself nothing, that's what it means to follow him. It means, a part of what it means to take up the cross and die to yourself. Part of the shame of following Christ, along with taking up your cross and seeing more, we'll see more. This is another new theme. So we've thought about this opening eyes, taking up the cross. New theme for you that we're going to repeat as we go through Mark is the little ones. So last week, the demon-possessed boy, he's a little one. And it's going to keep on coming up about how we treat the little ones, because you are a little one. It's part of taking up your cross. It's slightly humiliating. So how do we view ourselves through Christ and his cross? Well, you are the least, and therefore you are there to serve. Now, practically, what does that mean? Well, that's actually what we're going to see as we go through Mark's gospel, and actually it's what most of the New Testament is about. But it means, at the very least, my will is last. My will is the least important in the church, in my family. I may be called to lead in certain spheres, like my church or my family, but it's not by my own preference. It's for the good of others. And then we need to be honest about that. It's for your good. We need to be honest about that. It means put your preference in the bin, or as Jesus put it, take up your cross and die. Die to yourself. A couple of good examples of this. One I came across this week, one from a few years back. So there's a guy I know called Rob. He's a missionary in London. He's American. He's from the PCA. And he's been in England now for about 15 years, I think. And it's been, I don't know when he came, it's 10 years. It's been 10 years here now. And the first thing he got asked to do was mow the lawn at the church he was placed at the time, church in Ealing. And he said, yeah, of course. He said, internally I was going, 5 years at theological college, I'm an ordained preaching minister in the PCA, and I'm mowing the lawn. And he went, best thing for me ever. Another example is a guy called Maurice Wood, who some of you may have come across. So he was the Bishop of Norwich, and before that he was principal at Oak Hill, when Oak Hill was run on a shoestring. And he was taken from being the principal at Oak Hill to being Bishop of Norwich. And then they discovered that the loos were a bit smelly because Maurice was cleaning the loos and nobody knew. And you sort of think he's the one who's qualified to be a bishop or whatever that sort of role is. Now, in leadership, part of serving may be to ask people to do something they don't want to do. It might be to say, we're going to take the church in this direction that you're not going to like. But then that's part of taking up your cross, because I love to be loved. But the first is last. You die to your own wants. More than that, it means a bit more than that. Because if that's what it was, I think we could do it. But there's a bit more. It means that you are the least whom Christ welcomed. That means you welcome other leasts, whoever you think they are. So back when we look at the book of James, there's a bit in James, the pastoral issue that comes up of the poor and the problem of the poor being looked down upon and the rich being favoured. Now, I guess in some churches, in some cultures, there's a problem of that being reversed. We almost do it the other way round, or whatever the issue might be. But the point is, you receive them like a child, like someone who has nothing to offer you. So we receive people as Christians, we receive people in the church who have nothing to offer. In fact, perhaps doing so will be costly to you. There's some people who are hard for us to be with. I thought about giving some examples and I thought I'd better not. There are different reasons why there are some people we find hard to be with as a church or individually. And I guess there's as many reasons as there are people in the room, probably several reasons each. But notice that means this is not a position of superiority, but of equality. True equality, not the patronizing kind. You know, we're all equal here, aren't we? I mean, not quite as equal as me, but we are all equal. Have you ever seen the film Time Bandits with John Cleese as Robin Hood? And he goes, oh, you've not met the poor? Oh, the poor. You must meet them. They're delightful. And this sort of patronizing attitude that Robin Hood in Time Bandits has towards the poor. There's an American comedian, I'm not sure whether I should recommend him or not, it gets a bit sweary, but he's got dwarfism. And he absolutely mocks ruthlessly those who stick up for him. He can stick up for himself. He's short, but he can stick up for himself. He doesn't, and people go, no, he hates that. But there's none of that here, is there? Because Christ became nothing. The Eternal One became nothing to receive you. And so you become nothing to receive other nobodies like yourself. Now, I read something, I might have told you this before. I read something a few years ago by John Piper, and he's talking about this kind of thing and how it turns everything we see upside down. And he talks about how pride has two sides of the coin. So one side is there's the pride of my achievements. So you've got to view me as special because of the things that I've done or who I am. The other one is the pride of my failure and suffering. So I still want to be viewed special and be given special treatment because I'm on the bottom of the pile. So I need to be special as well. And either way, people need to say, I want you to think of me first in this. And I read that and I thought, that's a really good point. And I see that in a number of people I know. Fortunately, I don't suffer with either of those problems because I actually don't care what any of you think. And then I read J.C. Ryle, made the same 2 points and added there's a third worse kind, which are those who don't care what anybody thinks. And you just realize how pervasive these issues are. There's no escape. But Jesus' words to all of us is, we are all nothing whom Christ accepted, whom he died for. And that makes you a big deal. So as you look at anyone in the room and you go, I'm a nobody, they're a nobody, apart from they're not a nobody now because Christ came and died for that person. Paul expands on this in Philippians 2, we won't go into it, but he talks about how because Christ came down to nothing and then went from that nothing further down to the cross, it means that we receive anyone and we put their needs before ours. And that's what it means to be great in the kingdom. To be great in the kingdom means almost to be unknown in the kingdom. To form what Tim Keller called self-forgetfulness. We need to develop a self-forgetfulness. So who is the greatest? The least. And something that we'll finish on in a moment is this third thing, is who is the us we're talking about in verses 38 to 41. So John brings up this incident to Jesus. So this incident happens and he says, let me just tell you something that's just happened. In verse 38, there's a man casting out demons and the disciples try to stop him. Now notice a bit of a sore point there if you've been here last week. Last week, verses 14 to 29, the disciples can't cast out an evil spirit. And this man does, but they try to stop him. Now, I don't think this is just another interesting event. I think all these events tie together and actually flows into the next bit. It's tied into this first and last, accept the least, accept the child idea. So Jesus says, don't stop him or anyone like him, because verse 41, there's a blessing that they can be to us. And verse 42, us to them, that we're not to keep them from Christ and from his people. And that's what we'll pick up on next time. Now, let me just pause and make some caveats because of other things. You know, we can't just take one thing Jesus says and absolutize it. We need to think of other things he said and other things in the Bible. And we're not going to go through all of it, but the New Testament and Jesus warns of false miracles and false gospels. There are gospels that are not gospels. You may have seen, if you will follow church news, there was a recent statement of African church leaders about the prosperity gospel, saying it's not a gospel. Things should be done in a church by Christians. Things should be done decently and in order, 1 Corinthians 14. We should not be hasting the laying on of hands. That means we don't just ordain someone because they're keen, but there must be some discernment. And there's a desire to be biblical in all areas. So in theory, what we do in a church service, for example, is only what we're told to do in a church service, or by necessary implication we need to do. So that's true of mission, other things as well. We shouldn't just be pragmatic. All those things withstanding, it's one sense, it's okay to be fussy. That's why you come to a Presbyterian church, isn't it? Because you're a bit fussy. But But they, if they're a Christian, are on the same side as us. And even if they're really frustrating, and that can be really frustrating, but they're on our side. Notice here, John says, in your name. And Jesus picks up on that, verse 39, in my name. This man is doing what the 12 failed to do. Why? Because it's in his name. They failed because they're not relying on Jesus, because this identity crisis they've got going on. And they're not turning to him in prayer. They're going, well, we did it like this before, but it's not working now. But this man is still doing that thing, isn't he? He's noticing how we view Jesus and the cross affects how we see ourselves as the last, meaning we receive others, changes how we view other Christians. This mutual welcome, this fellow little ones, these fellow nobodies, are people just like us. Now, we need to define what we mean by Christian. We've done that already, haven't we? Those who receive Christ as it's revealed, the God-man, the crucified and risen Christ. We need to find what we mean by church. Maybe we'll do that another day. But in a one sentence, it's where Christians gather, the word is faithfully preached, the sacraments are practiced. That's a church. There's a lot that can still be wrong, and it's still a church. See that in the New Testament, don't we? We might not want to copy it, but it's a church. Now, I knew I was going to have a busy end of the week, so I prepared this sermon at the beginning of the week, beginning half of the week. And since I wrote what I'm about to say, I've had a number of challenges. Some of them may become obvious in weeks and months to come. Some you will never see. But when I actually find putting this into practice quite challenging. So I read this and go, did you really mean that, Lord? So what it means is that we don't despise the small or the quirky. You know, there's some things churches are very small and we can perhaps go, I mean, we're small, but I mean, man, they're really small. What are they doing wrong? Maybe they are, maybe they're not. Or they're quirky. They read a weird version of the Bible and they do street preaching and just a bit weird. Or as D.L. Moody put it, God prefers the way they do it to the way you don't. Or maybe we're jealous of the big. Now, sometimes numbers can be artificially inflated for a time. Churches have cycles. Tim Stanley, addressing non-Christians, said, I don't know why you're worried about Christians proclaiming the gospel. Don't worry about Christians doing evangelism, because it's a game they play amongst themselves. Church trends and reshuffle the pack rather than doing evangelism. We see that in cycles of students, don't we? And where they go, and every 5 years it's different. And there's various reasons. Some of them are good reasons. There are bad reasons. There are indifferent reasons. Some of it's short-lived. Some of it's not long-term sustainable. Not all of it's good fruit. And we may struggle as we see that and we feel jealous. It's leave it with God. Both at our end and their end. Leave it with God. And I met with some ministers this week, as I mentioned, and they're very, very similar churches to ours. Very similar. One of them said it's like replanting all over again. While another couple are growing very fast and can't really see any difference. Although, as the fast-growing church then shared their problems with me, I then went, let's just leave it as it is, shall we? Perhaps we will leave them with all the problems. But it's not our problem. We accept them. They are fellow little ones. Sometimes they might be acting like they're the big ones. They might be the weird ones, but they're our fellow little ones. A church I was at a number of years ago in London, it's quite large. By Chelmsford standards, it would be probably the largest church here, one of in London, sort of medium size. And I think most of you in the room, if not all of you, wouldn't like quite a lot. You'd be quite uncomfortable with quite a lot of what the church was like. And most of those instincts would be good. But I noticed, as you know, away for a couple of decades, I sort of look back and think, why did it grow and grow so fast? Here's a few things, apart from, God does what he wants. They have a go. They were pretty full on. They really did apply the Moody thing, that God prefers the way we do it to the way you don't. So they do it even doing it wrong. They'll just have a go. They embraced the weird. Now, some of the weird stuff they did probably was unnecessarily weird, but they embraced it. They certainly weren't worried. What would people think because we're a bit weird? That never crossed any of their minds. Their prayer meetings, there would often be 3 or 4 prayer meetings in a week. The men's prayer breakfast and the ladies' prayer breakfast started at 6. So we could people could come to the prayer meetings before getting on the train. The joint prayer meetings were similar attendance to the Sunday services. So it's interesting, we have probably about a fifth of people who come to our prayer meetings. Apparently that is statistically really good. This was more like 75%. And like the passage here, the man did it in Jesus' name, in his strength. Whatever they were doing that was weird or quirky or maybe wrong, they were relying on him, doing that full trust rather than technique. So they'd not lost their confidence in Jesus. So discernment is good, but apply it first to yourself and be slow to criticize others. John tried to stop someone from doing what John himself had failed to do and leave all the weird issues between them and God. So praise God when a Pentecostal church grows, or whoever it is, if it is a church, if it is the gospel, then praise God. To not look down one way or be nitpicky and jealousy the other, receive them. It should be a blessing from them to us. Often it isn't. Sometimes churches actually do an enormous amount of damage to each other because of this game they play between themselves. And Presbyterians are the worst. We're the fussiest. Now, of course, we might be sitting there going, other Presbyterians are. I mean, obviously CPC is different. If you think that, you've just demonstrated you are the worst. But the Westminster Confession of Faith itself says we should seek unity with all true believers. Now, they don't always want unity with us, but that's what we should seek. Why? Because we're all nobodies that Christ came for. We're all nobodies. Now, society tends to slip into one of 2 ditches, and the church frequently follows a decade later. But either total lack of discernment, anything, if it works and we like it, we'll just do that. And the other one is hypercritical. And often we flit it between the two. We get the worst of both worlds. But you see, Jesus' words here show us how to be discerning and open-handed at the same time. We need to be discerning and open-handed to others. But we can only do this as we see through the lens of Christ and the cross. Christ's identity as the God-man and the one who went to the cross and rose again, as Paul put it there, of our first importance. And that sets our priorities. But then it is then the lens, like I've got my lens on now, through which we see everything else and understand the world and ourselves and others. Christ is the eternal God, the Son, the King of the universe, and he made himself nothing as a servant and went to the cross. And he did so for you, an actual nobody, but he made you a co-heir with him. And that's the gospel. So that's a question for each of us, is have you received that gospel? That the King of the universe died for a nobody like you. And all you have to do is take it. And then once you have taken it, are you living out the gospel to take the cross and go to your own death and die to yourself for others, so that like Christ, you live for other nobodies? Let's pray.